In British Columbia, a bad faith eviction can cost a landlord tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes over 100,000. That number isn't just about compensation, it's about control. When penalty reaches this scale, the system isn't about resolving dispute anymore, it's to shape behavior. This video is not about blaming tenants or arguing the law. I'm here to decode the system. It's about understanding how we got here, because this system didn't appear overnight. Residential Tenancy Branch RTB is actually a relatively new system. It formally took shape in 2004 following amendments made to the Residential Tenancy Act in 2002. Before 1984, rental disputes in BC were not handled by a single unified body. Instead, the system was fragmented and inconsistent. Some tenancy cases went to provincial courts, others ended up in BC Supreme Court. Some were handled by government housing departments. Judges were still hearing many landlord-tenant disputes, but authorities were spread across multiple institutions. Who was responsible for what was always unclear. So in the early 80s, this structure began to crack. Rental disputes were increasing and the court system was struggling to keep up. The process was widely seen as slow, expensive, and overly complex. For people without lawyers, it was particularly inaccessible. The system worked far better for those with resources than for ordinary renters or small landlords. By 1984, the province began moving disputes out of the courts and into an administrative arbitration system. From that point on, the role of the regular court shifted. Instead of handling disputes at the front line, courts largely moved to enforcement and judicial review. The provincial government introduced a revised Residential Tenancy Act in 2002. 2 years later, the RTB consolidated arbitration and administration under a single public-facing body. The RTB became the place where most tenancy conflicts would be decided. This change was meant to simplify the process to make it faster, cheaper, and more accessible. Whether it achieved that goal is a different question. From 2004 to around 2017, the system was relatively stable. RTB didn't change much structurally. Most updates were just administrative or technical. Standardizing forms, clearer definition, improved efficiency. Termination rules were very simple. 1 month notice, limit compensation. Damage were tied to actual claim like unpaid rent or clear case of landlord misconduct. Back then, bad faith eviction meant obvious, visible violation, like the landlord changing the locks, cutting utilities, throw the tenant's belonging onto the street, harassment, intimidations. These were clear, provable acts, and the burden of proof rests with the person who makes the allegation. Before 2017, common sense and legal compliance largely overlapped. The system felt human. Fixed-term lease still exist. A 1-year lease ends, then roll into a month-to-month. Either party could terminate with a proper notice. These mirror rental system in most of the world. The landlord's biggest risk was vacancy. Rent and price were stable. This model works for over a decade until 2009. The global financial crisis reset capital flows.
Europe's largest economy, Germany, threw tens of billions at the problem last week. Now Britain has announced its second multi-billion-dollar economic rescue package.
This cannot be solved in one country alone. It is a failure of the international banking system that's got to be addressed.
There are a lot of small community banks are failing, especially ones in states that have had a lot of foreclosures. Georgia has seen a lot of bank failures. California, of course, because that's where the real estate bubble has been worse.
Luckily, Canada avoided worse of it. Largely due to conservative banking regulations, there was no subprime collapse like in the US. Meanwhile, interest rates in the US, Europe, and Japan dropped to nearly zero or below. Cash in the bank started losing value. Capital needs somewhere stable. Canadian real estate became that place. To global investors, Canada has a rare advantage. Strong rule of law, political stability, conservative banks, clear land title systems, protected private property. Vancouver in particular was perfectly positioned in Pacific Gateway. English-speaking, transparent pricing, high liquidity, a mature immigration system. RSS could enter and exit smoothly. At first, Canadian property wasn't about speculation. It was about capital parking. But when foreign capital kept flowing in, the structure shifted. Between 2013 and 2015, Vancouver real estate price nearly doubled. At that point, housing stopped being a safe haven. It became a high-return investment. Momentum fed itself. Unfortunately, Canada was not prepared. There was no immediate restrictions, no transparent ownership data, no clear distinction between owner-occupier or asset holders. Capital entered, but the cost landed elsewhere on local renters. In 2015, government responded with vacancy tax, aiming to push empty units to the rental market. Whether that helped is still debated, as more overseas landlords entered the market, many not living in Canada. Property management became fragmented. Units were managed by agents, companies, or relatives. Knowledge of local regulation varied widely. Rental supplies increased, but regulatory understanding didn't. Friction accumulated. Even today, industry experts and media acknowledge that foreign ownership data in Metro Vancouver has never been fully reliable. Estimates range from 1% to 25%. The BC government didn't begin formally track the buyer's residency until mid-2016, just before the foreign buyer tax. Without data, the system defaults to an assumption that landlord fully understood local law, maintenance standard, and RTB procedure. In reality, many didn't. This wave of capital inflow could have been an advantage for Canada, but without regulation, it instead became a key force, driving systemic imbalance. In 2017, a new government took power. The BC NDP, New Democratic Party, entered office during peak housing tension. Prices were disconnected from incomes, bidding wars were normal, and conditional and cash offer were common. Rents climbed rapidly. Rental evictions and landlord use eviction became political flagpoints. The NDP philosophy was clear. Government should intervene to protect vulnerable groups, especially tenants. After 2017, the RTB role changed. It was no longer just reactive, it became preventive. Under the old system, landlord had a critical flexibility, the ability to exit. Leased end, property reclaimed, rent reset. Many landlords assumed it was normal. That assumption broke. The goal of the reform wasn't to fix paperwork, it was to tighten control. Once the NDP took power, BC's rental system shifted direction, clearly and deliberately. But most landlords didn't notice at first. Not because of it was hidden, because of it was happening gradually. The risk didn't become obvious until people start getting penalized.
Go to the box, please, now!
That's when landlords realized that the rule has changed and the stake has changed with them. It wasn't a single announcement, it was a series of moves rolled out quietly, each one narrowing the room the landlord used to operate in. First change, July 11, 2017. The fixed-term lease stopped being an exit strategy. This is still widely misunderstood. This issue wasn't that lease roll into month to month, the issue was that the fixed term no longer gave you a natural ending point. From that moment on, if you want to end a tenancy, you need three things: a valid reason, a correct procedure, and a willingness to absorb the risk if challenged. And you can only end a tenancy when the system allows it. Second change, later that same year, landlord use and sales-related termination became more expensive and more regulated. Notice period doubled from 1 month to 2 months. Mandatory compensation was added. Formal RTB filing became part of the process, and critically, the reason you gave wasn't just an explanation, it became future evidence. Tenants were given a defined window to dispute. From that point on, ending tenancy stopped being a private contractual decision. It became a regulated act. Many long-time landlords kept thinking, I lock in 1 year lease, at least I'm safe for the year. The real risk was no longer vacancy. The real risk was whether you could ever regain possession at all. Third change, bad faith eviction penalties. If the reason you gave for taking back the units didn't match what you actually did, consequence escalates sharply. If rental eviction used as a pretext, units reclaimed, then re-rent at a higher price, the law labeled it bad faith. The penalties? Up to 12 months of rent paid to the tenant. The policy was designed to stop fake rental eviction and rent-driven displacement, but it also did something else. Behavior that once belonged to normal market decision-making was now treated as something punishable. Before 2018, BC allowed a rent increase tied to inflation plus an additional 2%. After 2018, that extra margin was removed, and rent increase was capped at inflation alone. Inflation can be higher than the rent cap and often is. Because the system assumed housing stability comes first, profits come second. When rent increase are restricted and ending a tenancy for higher rent carry financial penalties, the system effectively limits profit-seeking behavior. Whether that is fair or unnecessary is separate debate. That matter is that landlord must now operate within those constraints. Housing stress in BC is real. A lot of people are angry, a lot of people are frustrated. But before we decide who's right, who's wrong, maybe we should first ask one question. How did we get here? That's why I'm making this series. Because I live here, I care about my home, I care about British Columbia, and I care about my country. If you want to understand this system too, subscribe to the channel and let's decode one layer at a time.